A police interview room in 2017. Stephan Hough is cross-examined about a crime committed 44 years earlier.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
This man is violent through and through. It's part of his internal makeup.
But is he a killer? Hours before the body of Janet Cummings was found, the teenage Stephan Hough had been hiding in nearby undergrowth.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
Hough would walk free from suspicion as another man was convicted.
We all know there have been miscarriages of justice in the past.
Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
Stephan Hough went unpunished for 44 years, but then a knock on the door of Janet's mother signalled the reopening of the case.
In May 2016, we went to Irene Cummings' home address in Flint to inform her that North Wales Police were re-investigating the circumstances of Janet's death in 1976.
This was a mystery like few others. Investigators needed to know. Was it Stephan Hough who was responsible for the death of Janet Cummings? Why was Stephan Hough a young man made for murder? Using expert digital imagery from a specialist forensic artist to show the changing faces of a killer, this series reveals the life timelines and the red flags of those who will one day be investigated for taking a life.
The violence within this man is extraordinary, and murder was always going to be part of his life story.
Stephan Hough, even at school, someone to avoid.
Stephan Hough attended Flint High School, described by many as being a big, powerful lad, also a bully, was quite intimidating to other pupils.
For him, the bullying was just an inherent part of his way of conducting himself.
Big for his age.
He played sort of rugby for Flint Rugby Club as well, and played again for the senior club, even though he was only 16, 17 years of age, because he was a big, powerful, stocky man.
Dr. Donna Young's a forensic psychologist, trained to reveal the red flags and the timelines of killers, struck by Hough's willingness to put his weight about.
For anybody who knows the signs, there would have been something very animalistic about the way he conducted himself physically.
1976 Flint in North Wales. Population 5,000. A quiet, unassuming town nestled on the River Dee, just 20 miles south of Liverpool in England. A tight-knit community where people knew each other's business.
Flint town was generally a safe place to live. Flint had links to steel manufacturing and so forth. There was a high employment rate as a result of that. And generally, people in Flint felt safe.
It's quite a small community, so pretty much everybody would know everybody one way or the other in a town of that size.
Locals, familiar with each other, a safe place. But that changed one cold winter's afternoon. The Cummings family lived in a bungalow in King Edward's Drive near the town centre. Eileen and Ted had only one child, Janet.
She was a fairly quiet girl. She had a small number of friends, played in the street where she lived. At the end of the previous year, 1975, a new leisure centre had opened in Flint town, not too far from where Janet lived, and Janet and her circle of friends loved going down there to the swimming pool, and that was part of their interests.
On the evening of the 7th of January 1976, 15-year-old Janet Cummings and her mum had a bit of an argument. Janet wanted to go swimming, but her mum thought she looked unwell, so she told Janet she couldn't go. Janet was not to be deterred.
When Mum went to check on her about 7:30, She'd seen that Janet had actually left the house, left a note to say she'd gone to the swimming pool, but she would be back at 8:30 p.m, so Mum and Dad weren't too concerned.
A number of friends saw Janet that evening. One saw her at about 7:35 at the swimming baths. Another friend saw Janet at 8:15 in a road near to her house. And a bit later on, Janet went to a friend's house and asked if that friend could come out, but she wasn't allowed. That was the last sighting of Janet alive.
By 12 o'clock, 12 p.m, you can imagine that her parents were very worried indeed, and in fact frantic, so decided to walk down to the police station in Flint and reported her as a missing person. When you consider that Janet had never been missing before, when you consider that she was only 15 years of age, it was a dark, cold winter's night, then the risk associated with that missing person report would undoubtedly be high risk, and the policing response to a high risk missing person is very significant indeed.
Janet was discovered lying under a hedge on the edge of the local primary school field. Her body had been dragged along the ground. She was still clothed, but both shoes were missing.
She was found in the bushes, essentially lying slightly on one side, but on her back. Her body had been semi-concealed, and she'd clearly been murdered.
A post-mortem was carried out, and it was revealed that she had been violently sexually assaulted.
She was the victim of quite a violent sexual assault, which involved both vaginal and anal penetration. I think it's probably occurred at or around the time of her death or slightly afterwards.
The seemingly random nature of the attack would make this a tough investigation, not helped by the limitations of the day.
This is 1976, so there's virtually no CCTV, mobile phones haven't been invented, and forensic science is nothing like what it is today.
The young man responsible for Janet's death was Stephan Hough. He had carried out an appalling sexual assault prior to her death.
I'm firmly of the view that she walked past the back entrance of Stephan Hough's home address, and there he was laying in wait and attacked her at that location. He raped Janet and then smothered her until she actually died.
Understanding Stephan Hough means understanding his nature and motivation, both of which add up to him being lethally dangerous.
The murder itself is not actually the point of the activity. The point of the activity is the rape. The murder is collateral damage. It's an incidental side effect of the brutal way in which he carries out his rapes.
Hough is a sadistic rapist. He gets his kicks from seeing a woman completely overpowered in absolute distress and pain. He's not having sex with her for her privilege and enjoyment. He's doing it to harm her because he has selfish needs.
That attack was a huge warning sign that this was a man made for murder.
Hough had been in the year above Janet at high school, but he was never seriously considered a suspect.
On the day that Janet went missing, Stephan Hough was a 16-year-old boy, 5 days short of his 17th birthday. He lived with his parents very close to where the body of Janet was found, and also no more than about 400 yards from Janet Cummins' home address.
120 police began making door-to-door inquiries. All local men aged 17 to 22 were asked to account for their movements on the night of Janet's murder. Hough was one of them.
He was particularly nervous and couldn't really answer their questions. So the police that were conducting those house inquiries reported that matter to the detectives that were investigating that murder, because they felt that more questions needed to be asked of Stephan Hough.
The questioning removed him from the suspects list.
He had an alibi for the evening of the murder, which was a strange sort of alibi, but it's one that is often compelling.
He denied any knowledge of Janet's killing, but he did admit to being out that evening.
Hough openly told investigators that he had been masturbating in a car at the time of the murder before going on to commit another offence. And that's why he was nervous being interviewed.
He had the best sort of alibi. Not only did I not do this, but I was doing something else. And not the alibi of I don't know where I was. It was I know where I was and I was doing something very specific.
This is a man who will talk about his masturbation openly. This is a man who will try and use the fact that he's stealing as an alibi. He's utterly antisocial in his personality, as well as being psychopathic in his cognitive style.
It would be 40 years before the truth of what he had done that night would be wholly and forensically investigated.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephan Hough had figured out a way to avoid being charged in connection with the rape and death of Janet Cummings. He told officers he was breaking into a car at the time Janet had been murdered.
What he had done was taken the scent from him entirely. The police said, we're now happy with him because he's given us an account. He was clearly nervous because he'd been out committing crime.
He was later charged with that crime, went to magistrates' court and was fined.
The full details of Janet's death were not immediately released to the public. It had been a brutal attack. Police wanted a quick arrest. With Stephan Hough in the clear, another young man, Noel Jones, would soon come under the spotlight. Perfect for Stephan Hough.
This man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy.
His plan to get away with Janet's death was helped by what 1970s investigative methods were available to police, and the police's eagerness to charge someone.
Back then in 1976, there was no DNA technology. What could you do with swabs? Well, you can actually analyse those swabs to see if you get a blood grouping from what was identified to be semen, and that came back with a blood group O.
Armed with limited forensic evidence, the detectives turned their attention to who had the opportunity to pounce on Janet.
The police took an interest in members of the travelling fraternity that had set up an illegal encampment about 3 miles away from Flint in a small village called Northup.
An 18-year-old traveller called Noel Jones was arrested for Janet's murder. He was interviewed, but he was barely literate.
His was blood group O, as found at the scene.
Janet Cummings had a vaginal tear and she had an anal tear. Semen was found in the vagina. Now, in those days, when that was analysed, it was the same blood group type as Noel Jones, but then so are thousands and thousands of people in the country.
Unwittingly keeping Hough in the clear, Noel Jones's girlfriend told police that he had confessed to killing Janet. It was not true. He'd said it as part of a row with his girlfriend. Noel Jones suddenly found himself under immense pressure. At first, when questioned, he denied the offence.
Noel Jones went to court in the summer of 1976 and pleaded not guilty. He told his lawyer he wasn't responsible. He told his probation worker that he wasn't responsible and was denying everything to his family as well and saying, I haven't done this.
During this time, Hough remained beyond suspicion. Detectives felt they had their man. The horror of what Janet had suffered and a quirk of the law was about to help those pressing for the prosecution of Noel Jones.
When the judge heard the evidence of the pathologist in this case, where the pathologist said she wasn't actually strangled, there were actually very few injuries to the body of Janet. And what they felt is that whilst she was being raped, she was being smothered as well. The heart stopped as a result of the shock of what was happening. So when the judge heard that, he wasn't convinced that the prosecution could prosecute for murder and offered the alternative charge of manslaughter. Noel Jones, if he'd been convicted of murder, would probably have served in the region of 20 to 25 years in prison. He was told that if he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, he'd probably get about 12 years, but he'd only serve half that sentence.
Having suffered at the hands of other prisoners when on remand, Noel decided that he couldn't cope with a lifelong sentence. He could cope with 6 years.
He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings, and therefore there's a very strong presumption that anybody who's pleaded guilty to an offence is guilty of that offence.
Guilty of manslaughter, rape and buggery. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison.
It really does beg a belief that it could be, as it was then, that he was spoken to, and within a very, very short time, he'd made an elaborate, complete confession.
Who's a young man who's very vulnerable, has learning difficulties, and essentially is to some degree coerced into admitting that he was guilty of the crime.
Stephen Lloyd would come to know the Cummins family well as the police family liaison officer. Members of Janet's family were not convinced by the verdict back then. Lloyd spoke to one, Janet's uncle, Derek.
When Noel Jones was taken out in the police car on the second night, I think, and they drove round Flint, where he's pointing out where he saw Janet first of all, and where he followed it over the fields of Flint High School, you know, almost past Janet's home address, and to the Gorset Stones where they've attacked her. Derek certainly didn't believe that aspect of it, and I never did from 1976, so Derek had his doubts.
Doubts or not, Hough was now decidedly in the clear, and the reduction in the charge from murder to manslaughter would have repercussions 4 decades later, directly affecting the chances of ever charging Stephan Hough with murder. Hough was free to get on with his life, whilst Noel began his sentence.
This man will do whatever it takes to achieve the ends he desires, and he has the presence of mind, the systematic, strategic style of thinking that enables him to follow that through. So this man is a psychopath. His thinking is not in any way touched by morality or empathy. So for him, it was a useful situation when another man was convicted for his first crime.
He obviously thought that his troubles were over when Noah Jones was so publicly tried and so publicly pleaded guilty and served a sentence for it. And there was never any demur from Noah Jones about his guilt. There was never any appeal process, and it was a guilty plea from him, not a finding by a jury. Had it been a finding by a jury, that might have been less comforting.
Stephan Hough goes about his business literally having got away, scot-free, with killing Janet Cummins.
When you are a criminal with sadistic tendencies and you get away with your crime, it bolsters your sense of self. You feel that you are brighter than the police, you can outsmart authorities, and it means that those predilections and desires that you have within your nature, they have a new belief system, which is that you are above the law.
Feeling above the law, Stephan Hough was very much a danger to women.
Stephan Hough is not a one-off adolescent explosive incident kind of attacker.
He was made to attack again. By 1980, Hough decided to leave Flint and start a new life abroad, in the army.
The thing about being in the army is it gives you an opportunity to travel. And what we know about people who join the army who have this nature is they have many, many opportunities to harm vulnerable people along the way. And it's very hard, because of where they are and the travelling, to identify them.
Having so cynically avoided arrest and seen an innocent man convicted, what Hough did next is puzzling.
At the age of 21, whilst he was stationed in Germany, he got married, and he admitted to his wife that he'd killed someone back home. His wife asked him if it was Janet Cummings, but he wouldn't say.
It's hard to know why Hough would have decided to confide in his wife. We could imagine on a human level that he feels some level of guilt, but it could also be power play, a way of letting her know his capabilities and testing her.
It has never been revealed if his then wife believed him, or if she felt too frightened to report the conversation. Hough was still able to plan attacks on women.
Being in the army, you are very, very trusted. It's very rare for any human being to see a person in position of power, a position of protection, to believe that they could be sinister. So it automatically creates leverage. People will feel safe around you, and that gives you an incredible access.
If his uniform camouflaged the intent of a sex attacker, he soon used it.
The receptionist incident is where it all came together for me.
He carried out an attack at a hotel. Stephan Hough had been out drinking for most of the day. This female walked into the toilets, closely followed by Stephan Hough. He attacked that female and he strangled her to the point that she passed out. And they were disturbed, or so he was disturbed, and ran away. But witnesses were able to say that he was clearly British because he still had his uniform on. Inquiries led them to Stephan Hough. Stephan Hough was charged with grievous bodily harm.
Hough was thrown out of the army for the attack and in 1988 was sentenced to 5 years in a military prison.
It's violence against a stranger. It's not violence that's triggered by any kind of emotional build-up, which is what we ordinarily see. It's violence that is out of all proportion. It's extreme violence that is readily triggered. And then there's the abductive quality to the violence, where Hough wants to get his victim away in private so he can relish the act of carrying out the attack on her, is a frightening indicator of somebody for whom violence is a purely focused pleasure.
By the 90s, living back in his hometown of Flint, Stephan Hough was now in his second marriage and had 2 children.
He was a long-distance lorry driver, doing most of his journeys abroad. And that was something which perplexed all of us, that had he had the opportunity, as he clearly did, to make a new life in a different country, he could have done. But he returned to his home, he stayed in the same place in Flint, lived there in the same street he'd grown up in, and was there for everybody to see.
How would justice ever catch up with Stephan Hough?
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that. It seemed a bit bizarre, really.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
Stephan Hough lived under the radar throughout the 90s and into the new century.
This is a predator who will be walking among us freely.
But justice began to move in on him because of retained evidence found on Janet's body 4 decades earlier. Police had always known that swabs taken at the time indicated there was a potential second attacker. Advances in DNA tracing meant that North Wales Police could hold a case review.
In 2006, an officer who was working on that investigation decided there may be merits in having a look at what was uncovered forensically from that, to see actually was there a potential second person involved in that killing.
A new DNA imprint was found, but could not be matched with anyone on the national database. So little help to Noel Jones, who was by now living a new life.
Detectives were no doubt disappointed when the national DNA database did not throw up a match for the samples retrieved from Janet's body.
The lack of a match, however, did not detract from the facts, which were now clear. Evidence suggested Janet had indeed suffered at the hands of an attacker other than Noel Jones. Perhaps Noel Jones was an innocent man.
I became concerned about the original conviction, and felt that there was this very strong possibility that this was a miscarriage of justice.
With no more leads, the case was cold. Hough was still in the clear. It was now a waiting game. Police had DNA from an unknown man found on Janet's body in Flint in 1976, and no more.
We decided to upload it onto the national database to see if, at any time in the future, that would actually hit against a person that may be of interest to that inquiry.
To avoid detection, all Hough had to do was to commit no further crimes. But in 2016, literally on his home turf, Stephan Hough was unable to resist temptation.
Stephan Hough is arrested in connection with allegations of a similar nature to those surrounding Janet's disappearance and death.
He allowed a child to have a party at his home, and during the course of that party, people drank rather more than they should have done, and he became embroiled in physical contact with one of those there, which left his mark in the form of DNA.
His DNA was taken and it was loaded onto the database, and it gave a direct hit between that swab result from the trousers of Janet Cummings and the DNA of Stephan Hough.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database.
Stephan Hough's continual offending did put him at risk of eventually being arrested, certainly. But we shouldn't underestimate just how powerful the violent drive is within him, or how arrogant his thinking would have been about the likelihood of detection.
It just shows you that even killers who believe they've got away with it are more and more recognising that it's only a matter of time before they're caught.
As Janet's family and Hough were both living in Flint, this was a delicate operation.
My involvement with the family, I can only describe them as absolutely fantastic, hard-working family who supported North Wales Police all the way through the 2016 investigation.
40 years on, the community of Flint was thrust into the spotlight again as Janet's traumatic killing hit the headlines.
I think there was a little bit of disbelief in the town of Flint, really, that a local man could have done such a thing, where they believed for so long that a traveller was responsible, which I guess fitted into their mindset, really, of it not being a local person.
After 4 decades, police have 57-year-old Stephan Hough in custody and can start the detailed re-examination of the case. They were determined to make no mistakes.
The most important thing in any investigation is the continuity and integrity of evidence that's seized, exhibits, whether they be clothing, forensic exhibits, making sure that whoever handles that evidence is signing the exhibit labels, the continuity statements, and their subsequent integrity, the way the material is stored and preserved. It cannot be challenged.
He was taken to North Wales, where he was interviewed over a period of several days. He initially started to speak to the police. He was initially quite confident, because naturally we wouldn't disclose the strength of our forensic evidence from the off.
First of all, we'd like to talk to you about the murder of Janet Cummings in 1976. What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
He came across initially as quite a cocky person who would talk about anything and everything at that particular time.
He denied any involvement in Janet's killing, despite the fact that they presented him with the very compelling DNA evidence.
So she's been vaginally raped, anally raped, and during the course of that, she's also suffered suffocation around the face and neck. And certainly those injuries that I've specified to you indicate that. Okay? Now, taking into account all those injuries and the cause of death, Stephen, are you responsible for those injuries?
No comment.
It was disclosed to him that his semen had been found on Janet's trouser leg, and semen had been found on intimate samples taken from Janet as well, where he crossed his arms and went no comment to every question after that.
Mouth swab is taken from you. Okay? That swab is loaded onto the DNA database. That swab is a full hit on the semen cell stain from Janet Cummings' trousers in 1976. Now, if you fully understand what I'm saying, if you want me to explain it, I'll explain it to you.
Hough's DNA match proved that he was 1 billion times more likely to be Janet's killer than anybody else.
And that's when Stephan Hough probably on the advice of his solicitor. We don't know. But then he didn't talk to us anymore.
So, Stephen, please explain how your semen is on Janet Cummings' discharge.
No comment.
Is there any explanation you can give me at this time? Are you willing to give an explanation?
No comment.
Hough displayed no emotion, no remorse, no surprise to Donna Young's.
The dragging of the victim into the bushes and then attacking her while she's face down is very consistent with an animal attacking another animal in the wild. The humanity of the prey is utterly irrelevant.
The biggest obstacle that police and prosecutors faced was that, officially, this crime already had been successfully prosecuted. Patrick Harrington QC was charged with defending Hough.
The obvious and curious aspect to the preparation of this case was that at the time of the murder, a suspect had not only been arrested, but made what was on the face of it a complete and accurate confession as to what he said he had done. And when he got to court, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Janet Cummings.
We were now prosecuting someone 40 years later of a crime where someone stood convicted of that offence.
If someone else had been responsible for the death of Janet Cummings, how could Hough be guilty? Did he stand a realistic chance of avoiding conviction?
It was a unique case because Noel Jones stood convicted of that killing. So we knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephan Hough to say, actually, this is what happened to me back then. This is why I signed a false confession, and this is me now.
What can you tell me about your involvement in the murder of Janet Cummings in January 1976?
No comment.
When under interrogation by police, Stephan Hough showed no signs of confessing.
Stephen, are you responsible?
No comment.
Building their case against Hough meant focusing on the scientific strides made in forensic investigation over 40 years and ensuring the facts from the night of the attack could be established. Pathologist Dr. Brian Rogers was asked to re-examine the original pathology report.
I first got involved with this case, which was a cold case back in 2016, when North Wales Police contacted me to see if I would be able to have a re-look at the forensic evidence.
It was not going to be straightforward.
The post-mortem was limited, and the photographs were quite limited of the post-mortem. They were also rather poor quality. They were only black and white. You couldn't see things clearly.
Step by step, the crime was revisited. From the head wound that Janet suffered, it seemed clear that her attacker was prepared to use catastrophic violence.
It looked like a blunt force impact. I mean, in theory, it could have been caused if her head's been pushed down onto a rock or a stone or something like that, or she could have been hit with something. If someone was struck with a bottle, it would produce a laceration of that type.
Using his stature violently was a Hough trademark. Rogers confirmed that Janet had been held face down with her neck compressed by someone's hands.
The whole picture of her death pointed to one of external airway occlusion, which is essentially this, for whatever mechanism, hand or face down, and neck compression. I mean, essentially, she was suffocated during this attack.
Then there were the new findings.
The vaginal and anal swabs were still on record, and a DNA match was subsequently made.
DNA has come on in leaps and bounds, even in the last couple of decades. Time was when you'd have to explain to a jury how the calculations are made about probabilities. Nowadays, juries are sufficiently familiar with DNA because it's on their radar, that once you tell them the DNA was there, they are perfectly prepared to accept that as being definitive.
The case against Hough was mounting. There were his other offences to be considered too.
His offending history had continued for 40 years, and his pattern of offending had continued, and clearly sexual offending was very prevalent within his offending history and offending cycle as well.
2016 and Stephan Hough is finally facing a day in court related to the rape and death of Janet Cummings. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Hough refused to admit his guilt.
He went to trial, denying the case, said he wasn't responsible.
He was remarkably relaxed. I wouldn't say calm, but he was certainly relaxed.
Hough's defence argued that there could have been a mishandling of the investigation in 1976.
We actually called as a witness for the defence the barrister who had represented Noah Jones as the junior barrister at his case in 1976. And he was resolute in the evidence that he gave that there had been nothing about the confession made in the police interviews, supported by his confession by a guilty plea, that caused the barrister any concern at all.
Noel Jones, now married with children, was still at the centre of the case and had served 6 years for Janet's death. If Harrington could establish that Noel was guilty, how could Hough be guilty?
If we could establish, just on the basis that brought a query to the mind of the jury, that he may have been the killer, and having pleaded guilty there was a strong presumption he was, if we could establish that, then by a process of elimination it could not have been Stephan Hough.
We knew that we had to get Noel Jones to give evidence at that prosecution of Stephan Hough to say, actually, it wasn't me. Basically, the pressure I was put in by the police back then made me sign and say things that weren't true. And he gave really compelling evidence.
By denying his guilt, Hough himself was content to leave a stain over the character of the innocent Noel Jones.
There are two parts of Stephan Hough's personality which meant he could sit back and watch an innocent man serve years in prison. The first is that he is a psychopath. He has no empathy. He has a purely strategic focus to his thinking. The second is he has an antisocial personality.
It was time for a jury to decide if Stephan Hough was a man made to kill.
The jury were asked to retire, having heard the evidence. But significantly in this case, and I think it's the only time it's happened in legal history, is that the judge gave two directions to the jury before they could convict Stephan Hough. They had to be sure, beyond reasonable doubt, that Noel Jones was not connected whatsoever to that murder before they could move on to the evidence against Stephan Hough, and to be sure again, beyond reasonable doubt, that he was, in fact, responsible for the killing. So there were two hurdles, if you like, for us to get over in that court case. But we got over them.
Hough was convicted of manslaughter, rape and buggery. For manslaughter, he got 12 years. For rape, he got 8 years. And for buggery, he got 8 years. But all those sentences were to run concurrently. In other words, at the same time. So the total sentence was just 12 years.
The people of Flint, still around from 1976, and Janet's family, finally had justice. To some, only of a sort.
What must be heartbreaking in this crime is that Janet Cummings' family never lost sight of their desire to bring the person who killed their child and their relative to justice. And what justice is there in a 12-year sentence for stealing a whole life?
I think the family are certainly a different family to what they were in 2016 when the investigation was taking place, in a better place. And I think they probably a bit more relaxed and, content that the right person has been convicted of Janet's murder and that an innocent man has now been exonerated.
Hough was sentenced to 3 offences for sexually assaulting the 15-year-old girl in 2016. Because Noel Jones had been sent to prison for manslaughter, not murder, Hough, a minor at the time of the offence, benefited from the lesser charge.
He was naturally very relieved that he was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, with the consequences that brings, and I think he was simply looking forward, counting the days, to when his eventual release will come. Had he been convicted of murder, that would effectively mean that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, because he would have got a significant tariff for this offence, 15 years as an absolute minimum, probably rather longer than that.
In the judge's sentencing comments he pointed out that Hough had been booted out of the army after being found guilty of assaulting yet another person. Clearly, that assault may never have happened if Hough had been arrested way back when in connection with Janet's killing.
In 1976, confused and vulnerable, Noel Jones had admitted to a crime that he did not commit.
It was only in 1982 when he was released that he was able to rebuild his life. He changed his name so that he'd be anonymised, went on to marry, had some children, and it was only his family that he ever told about what happened to him.
Jones had never challenged his conviction, but after Stephan Hough was put behind bars and then aged 61, Noel decided to clear his name.
There was very little publicity about Noah Jones's acquittal in the Court of Appeal. Sir Brian Levison heard the appeal, apparently with great sensitivity, and the appeal was allowed, as I say, without any resistance from the prosecution. And he is now unconvicted, acquitted of the crime to which he pleaded guilty 40 years ago.
Police finally got the man responsible for the death of Janet Cummins. The grim story of the crimes of Stephan Hough have spanned 4 decades.
I've prosecuted or defended in more than 250 homicide cases, but there are certainly some that stand out in your recollection, and this will be one. I'll never forget Stephan Hough.
Stephan Hough retains control of one thing, a precise confession as to what happened that night, leaving the family still wondering.
They deserve to know where Janet was killed. They deserve to know what the full circumstances of her death were. Because they weren't there, were they? And the only person that was there who knows is Stephen Anthony Hough, who so far hasn't told anybody what the circumstances are.